Christians see the USA, but they see it through the eyes of faith. A secular person does not see it through the eyes of faith, but they see it a different way. Do you understand? Just as a Caucasian may see the U.S. in one light, but an African American may see it in another light. Why? Because they have two different histories. They have dealt with two different things. One of the biggest problems is they haven't shared their stories in an open forum enough so that all people understand, meaning we have a severe lack of education in this country. If you were to say that word republic, you would get too many definitions out of that word. It should mean one thing to all people who live here, but it doesn't. It means several different things. And in this day and age, with the education system, because it's been agendized, meaning that most of your curriculum is based on somebody else's agenda, they teach in very specific ways to get people to think in very targeted manners. So they would go out and accomplish specific things or support specific causes. That's an issue because no one has a common base knowledge of what the republic is. And so some people see it as good. Some people see it as not so good. Some people see it as a place of freedom. Others see it as a place of bondage. Still others see it as a place of captivity. Some people see it as a dream. Some people are trying to escape it. If the education system was a standard through all 50 states, everybody would see it for what it really is. So agenda is going on for a long time, and secrecy going on for a long time has really hurt us. And what you really see happening is all of that pain, all of that hurt, all of that mistrust, everything has boiled up to the cap. See, I can't help but to go back and stay in the realm of truth. And when I go back, I see the pundits on TV very angry because one of their greatest policies were shot down, this, that, and the other. So both sides have an anger problem. This nation has an anger problem. Why? Because trust has been lost from race to race. Trust has been lost. And when you get in any time of high emotional state, naturally everybody's going to bounce back to that comfort area, which is to be back with those of your same color, your same type, your same thought patterns, so that you can be safe. Everybody will seek a place of comfort or safety, which means they will further segregate themselves away from each other. We're seeing this also. The words Democratic and Republican have become weapons. It's weaponized. You see conservative and liberalism, which equates to Democrat and Republican. And when you start talking about these two words, you're starting a war right then and there. Because people say, how can you be a Democrat if so-and-so? Or how can you be a conservative if so-and-so? And it's all wrong. Those people who come to this nation, you, me, and everybody else who are raised in this nation, we were the ones raised in the realm of agendas and secrecy. There was no transparency. No matter who was in office, there were too many secrets. Wouldn't you guys agree? And due to those secrets, a massive distrust began to happen because the first thing that goes wrong, somebody's going to put their finger and blame it on somebody else. That's just the way it is. People always look for something to blame or someone to blame for everything that goes wrong. If they start having problems in life, you couples out there, when you start having a problem in the home, don't you look at each other strange? You try to find reason for the problem, and normally you begin to vent to those you share the house with first. So you blame somebody in the house for your issues. You may not communicate that, but that's indeed what takes place for the most part. We see that in this country. One side blaming the other. When in truth, the truth is just about everybody is fed up with the antics that are going on. We live in the digital age. Boundaries have been taken apart. Cultures and societies have been reformed. A lot of people, they have several outlooks, and we're going to look at those, the goal to what they're doing, because you have to have a goal behind what you're doing. What is the end result of getting everybody out of office who is known as a corrupter? Then what? Has anybody ever gone that far? Many people have not, because I've heard it with my own ears firsthand, that people believe if they get certain people out of office, then the world is going to be this loving place. No, it isn't. We seem to forget the days prior to when we did have freedom, and when this world was dominated, or the U.S. was dominated by one race, that even within one race, you had people who will never agree with how somebody else is running something. There were murders. There were all sorts of crimes taking place. People forget that. They would assume kill somebody at a moment. They would get bored and do that. You still have lunatics out there you have to deal with. It's not going to solve the problem. Other folks will be corrupted, and they will follow suit with those who they accuse are corrupted. So what they're looking for, they're thinking, their logical thinking is, if we get rid of this issue, we're going to have a better America. But that is not practical. Nothing in history has ever been like that. Nobody has ever had a utopia like that unless it was forced. And the Bible teaches us something far different. See, we can never forget about the Bible. You have the goal. One is to restore the republic. My question is, to what? Now, that's based on a point of view. If you're going to restore the republic, in what state are you going to restore it? To what standard? Because these differences in standards is what caused the diffusing of the republic several times. We have too many different ideologies. With all those different ideologies, we're always going to have war. All of us should understand that. That's an unequivocal truth. It's happened all throughout man's history. Even in God's holy land, that same thing took place. One would turn against the other. Within the republic, there is something people can start working on to make sure they have, but it's been assaulted. Family values. How many sit down with a whole household and eat breakfast? How many sit down with a whole household and eat dinner? Or is it like this? Everybody goes off into the corner. They go play video games. They get on the phone. They're so busy researching, doing whatever they do. People live in the same house, even on lockdown, but they don't see each other. How many have seen it that way? The family unit has been assaulted a long time ago. Families were tight prior to the 80s. In the 80s, people began to have fun because of technology. And right now, we live distant from each other, but live in the same house, but we're so distant. So we have to reset family values. That's not something any government can do. That's something that people have to agree to. That's something people have to begin to teach their children. We do have a chance, but we have to teach the children a truthful way at living. They're still going to deal with the same problems, but at least they will have morals behind it. We've lost everything. And again, through secret agendas, through secrets and planning and more secrets, things that happen that are off the wall, unnecessary wars, this, that, and the other. We have lost the family unit. It's very difficult to get back. Didn't you guys notice in the 80s, something that was a negative miracle began to happen? You know what it was? A lot of families lost the dads of the home. That's when the mothers started raising their children by themselves, and that number increased until you got up into the 90s, where many women were raising children by themselves and the fathers took off. Do you know why? Because Satan is after the seed, which is the man. Satan did that. It's not that the father's some ignorant individual. It's that devils were after the male of the house, a seed bearer, to keep them away from the children, to continue to break up the family unit. But we didn't recognize that, nor did anybody pray for that. In fact, people were praying the opposite. Well, just get away from them. We weren't teaching people how to fight for their families. They were too busy teaching people how to separate themselves from the person who causes trouble so the household can have more fun and more entertainment. The second thing, besides family values, if that can be restored, that takes massive re-education. That takes a severe check. All of us need to look back at our households. We have allowed technology to make us distant, to change us. We are actually different. What's next? We already have faith because we're Christians, but one of the big ones that even the secular folks can do, family values. The next is the rule of law. The rule of law should not be some word that scares one race to pieces and gives another race ideas to manipulate. It shouldn't be that way. So something else happened in the 80s. Do you guys remember what that was? Because corporations were booming back in the 80s and everybody was coming out with these devices. Near the end of the late 80s, people started suing people. Do you guys remember that? And through a person suing somebody else, protective measures were taken by each corporation to make it difficult to buy their products or to fashion ways that they would do business where nobody could actually sue them, where they were not liable for certain things. In so doing, things became very harsh. The 90s, people still enjoy things, but the corporations changed. So first the family values, then the corporations began to alter. And when they altered due to suing, one person suing another, they began to lobby the lawmakers. And the lawmakers came up with a countless, you can't even count how many amendments, how many bills were introduced during that time, which took the law and complicated the law so much, it's very difficult to interpret this very day. So through people trying to take advantage of corporations, trying to get that free money so they can enjoy themselves and live their lives like they're in a movie, corporations took extra steps and they had to get the government involved. And because people loved money at the time, and because entertainment was at its maximum, because Hollywood stars were all but worshipped during that time, they went for it. The government was corrupted then. Don't you remember how out of touch the government was? How many organizations were lobbying all the time until they came up with special terms, special procedures I mean, my goodness, these congressmen, the people that work in the White House, none of them make over $300K a year. So why are they multimillionaires every single year? All these things, we thought that, it would just continue and nothing would ever happen somewhere down the line. They convinced everybody else, hey, we got to look out for Social Security and all these things, when in truth, this is a problem. The problem we face right now was a big issue. Next, we get into faith, specifically what a person believes in. That began also back in the 80s. Do you guys remember the church boom in the 80s? Because CDs were coming out. Do you remember that? So then every church had to have music. And so that involved the churches into something called making money. They also had VCRs. They also had cable. When cable came out, everybody was rushing to get to television, then satellite, so forth and so on. And so that became a big money driver. And you could actually make a lot of money from a lot of people if you were to be on television. You remember the corrupted ministers. You remember all the ministers that came. It began back then in the 80s, but they became apologetic at the end of the 90s. You remember the people that were busted, the people that didn't do things right, and they were just heaping money unto themselves. You guys remember public apologies? Remember the people that were hauled off to jail because of what they did? And what was the lure? The same thing everybody else has been dealing with. It all began in the 80s. It escalated. It was unchecked, and everybody had their fingers in it, and we thought it would not bite us in the end. Or it's biting us now. Faith was a bit pure. It was nothing like it is today. Most of the people that are really celebrated today lived back in the 80s, but they did not compromise. They didn't get caught up in what everybody else got caught up in. And all of it was driven seemingly by entertainment, the entertainment industry. That's when Hollywood boomed. That's when all the great movies came out. That's why people say right now, I just loved the 80s. I bet you did, because everybody was entertained. Everything was brand new. New things were coming out. People were innovative. And where did they put their innovation? Entertainment. New toys. Faith began to really upset a lot of people because they saw the folks losing their value. In fact, something else happened in the 90s. That's when churches actually began to separate and talk against each other. They began to compete to have the same people in their congregations. But they began to compete like that. That really put a rip in the minds of so many. It's also the time when a lot of people moved away from the church. It's also a time when most of your cults popped up. You know, when cults normally form when the church is messing up. When the church is deceived, you always find cults that stand right there to get the people that the church has shunned to the left or to the right. Has anybody been checking these historical points to see these little issues that were left unchecked? Now we're dealing with it. See, this goes deeper than fixing one problem. Now it's in the souls of men. Now it's in the hearts of men. It's very tough to change somebody's heart. Instead of leaning for those of faith, instead of leaning on the Word of God where everything is consistent and common, we fought one another by way of interpretation. That's why you have so many denominations now. You remember the denominations war? There should be no fighting in the church, should there? You think there would be no fighting in the church. But because people have different perspectives, it is. And it is worse than the fighting in the world, because they murder a person without a weapon you can see. Do you guys see all these problems and all the things we just allowed? We allowed them to grow. When they did grow, they went right into the children. Those children are the ones who now push agendas, get behind agendas. The president of a company is not the most valuable person. The president of a company, that person that makes all that money, he just knows how to pick the best employees, to assign the best executives. That's what makes him so rich. It's not that he is doing all the work right, but he's picking the right people for the job. And those folks they picked, they came from that generation that lived in the fallout of massive confusion, massive competition, when people began to define themselves. Do you guys remember the time in the 90s when a new generation had popped up? When this new generation was about 20 years old, what did they begin to do? They said, hey, I want to distinguish myself from everybody else. One of the first things they did was go get 200 piercings and 1,000 tattoos. You guys remember that? Because essentially a tattoo helps a person on the inside define something they want to express. A tattoo can express that. Everybody has messed up their flesh, so that's no mark against you. Jesus saves the soul, not the flesh. But people ran out to go pierce themselves and get tattoos to distinguish themselves. themselves because they had something to express. That should have been a telltale sign that there's something inside of people trying to get out, and nobody's listening, because the suicide rate went up hand in hand when the people ran off to get piercings and tattoos. Entire cultures overlooked it, and then the internet came. Prior to the internet, did you guys remember? We may have had issues and problems, but we were still growing. People were very creative. I remember a time before the internet when creativity was just running through me all over the place. Something happened when the internet came out. So let me discuss that, because that's where something else took place, which really is causing a lot of problems today. Before the internet, companies did lobby in Washington, but for the most part, everybody did not know the details about it, so they went on about their business. Also, government did not overreach into people's lives too much. So they did what they did without the people's knowledge, and the people were somewhat, they were semi-okay with that. Things were flourishing all over the place. Things were normal. As soon as the internet came out, several things took place. One of the first things that took place was people were no longer limited by way of information, going to the library, having a set of books, encyclopedias, whatever the case may be. Everybody began to educate themselves by way of the internet. And those who weren't educated, they began to interact with other folks who knew other things. The knowledge base of the populace grew. As soon as that happened, people one by one began to do something. Aside from pornography, they began to find out that these corporations were doing things with the government they shouldn't do. When they found that out, they demanded that lawmakers have some accountability behind what was happening. Do you guys remember when the internet changed? That's when the media began to be the major point of how they handled this issue. People found out about how they handled that issue. People found out about. Do you remember the Gulf War? It's when Schwarzkopf kicked out the media from the Gulf War because the media was holding everything up. Why? Because of people's accountability and the complaints of people. We're natural-born complainers. When we feel that something is oppressing our lives or taken away from us, we're going to point a finger and put a blame on something. We do that. When people found out about these deals with corporations and the government, one of the first things they did was they began to protest. They began to demand accountability. Well, guess what came from that? A slew of policies that made it difficult to lobby. A slew of policies that actually added some accountability. But because of that, something else happened. When companies were liable for things, when companies could no longer do something so easily, that's when disgruntled individuals began to share things with the people about these companies. And people used to hate corporations. Back then, remember, they blamed everything on the corporations. Stories were printed. The corporations were going to take over. All sorts of things happened with the corporations because it wasn't the government first. It was the corporations. They were the devil. And everybody was after the corporations. Boycotts took place. There were times when people would not buy clothing or would not do business with a certain store because of what they were doing. As a result of that, more policies took place. Now, this adds layers upon layers upon layers upon layers of secrecy, of legal jargon, and everything else, until it got to the point where everybody was scared to make a move, and they had to get the public on their side before they did anything. So then they began to brag or promote things corporations did with the people. They ran campaigns. They changed opinions. They let you know they were supporting certain things within America. And it was almost like a contest when that took place. And of course, people were suing, but people were also being educated. The corporations started to tell on the government. And they told about a bunch of wicked things they were doing. They began to print books and everything else. All this came from the corporations. That's when they fought back, telling on the government. And the government people got in trouble by way of the people because the people demanded an answer. This caused people to be nosy. This caused a lot of drama. When that drama took place, people began to notice a wickedness in the government, and a slew of conspiracies came forward. When that happened, many became instant experts in the law overnight and began to teach other people about secret things. That's where it really began, through a culmination of issues and problems and everything else. And when policies thickened to the point where you could no longer decipher them, where you had to have a constitutional expert to really find out what was going on, everything was distorted. When things become distorted, when things are too cumbersome, too confusing, you know what people do? They break down into groups and they become the experts for that specific group. Now, everybody believes differently about the same thing. Now that word democracy means something different in the ears of many different groups. Now you're dealing with groups of people which was bolstered by social media, but all the borders were taken down. The corruptness of the government had been established. People paid the price for that also. They did, because they had to watch everything they did. Have you noticed that even now, when somebody comes on television, they say anything about politics, they have to talk to you. They have to convince you. Although they don't want your word, your feedback in anything, they have to talk to you. This lessens the complaints to come back. They do that all the time. And then we get into the rights age. That came with the internet too. People having a right to do things. Until it got to the point where stealing information was one of the biggest and hottest things people could ever do. Now take note, while all this was happening, we confused our own world. Instead of simplifying, being open and transparent, people said, no, we're going to bog this one down in policy. Nobody can understand that. They'll never look again. So people adopted this attitude of what though? Out of all of that, when they started getting away with all this legal stuff, I remember, because one of the number one conversations on the internet had to deal with each individual, and each individual wanted to be right about what they talked about. Because being right about what you talked about was currency over the internet. It quickly turned into currency. To get people to listen to you, you had to know what you were talking about. You had to make your story appealing and everything else. So people began to present themselves as experts. Maybe you're a skewed expert or a self-taught expert. You're teaching people something different than somebody taught somebody else down the street. Now, everybody is at war because they want to be right. That further polarized Democrats and Republicans, because if you notice right now, the true fight is one side fighting to be right over the other. No matter what happens in between, no one is willing to compromise. Haven't you noticed? And so people demand that their best player win. So essentially, folks, to really condense this, when the internet came out, all these happenings in the world became just like a football game. And everybody wants their side to win over the other, and they're not satisfied until they win. If you don't believe that, you can see people crying during football games. That football team is not paying them. Why would they cry? Because they want their side to win. They're very passionate about that. And when you start to invest yourself and you think that's what life really is, because essentially people have defined what life is differently, all because of the internet, because of how they interact with the internet. Look at Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. The Republicans believe that they're right in what they're doing, that the Democrats are wrong. On the same issues, the Democrats believe that they're right, the Republicans are wrong. So then naturally the populace is going to be polarized too. Everybody being polarized, nobody can agree. And it's become quite militant. They'll go through strange lengths to prove a point. Civilians, the people who are not involved in government, they only know what they see. They only know what's being presented. They know that something is wrong. They can put their finger on it. Lots of people suffer from anxiety because they can't trust anybody. This has broken down the fundamental glue of the republic is broken. See, people like in the Democratic Party and Republican Party, among the Republicans, they think, well, there's nothing wrong with the glue. We're all together. Yeah, but you're distant from the other side. And they almost lost the meaning to having two polarized sides. One side gives the other side balance, which means both voices are required to get things done. They have forgotten about that because what they want now is for one side to have it their way. People right now, I guarantee you, people right now forgot that small point. You have Democrats and you have Republicans, and they do stand for different principles, but they're both for the republic. They are the checks and balance system, so that no one decision will go forward and be passed without the scrutiny of all views. They have forgotten that. Now they're at war. They were not to be at war. They were to be a machine where no dictator could ever get anything through the Congress or anything that looked like it was against Republic, and the ideologies of the Republic could not get through. They have forgotten their role because now they're at war. And when leadership went to war, when leadership openly conveyed how they hated one another, what did they think the civilians would do? Because you have people behind each person in leadership. People feel passionately, standing behind the people they believe in. Just like they cry at the football games and they celebrate at football games, they do the same thing with these political figures. It has become their point of interest for their lives. Those in leadership need to understand this, that for each of them, there's a group of people blindly following them. They are responsible for every word they speak. And the media is given to report to the people the truth so that the people, their questions can be answered and questions that they have can be posed to the government. The reporters were never supposed to go out there by themselves to dig up a juicy story. All that came with this entertainment nonsense. So we started out being a serious people about the republic, and then it quickly became a game, and everybody played, even the Christians, because if Christians would have prayed in the manner the living God told them to pray, none of this stuff would have surfaced, or certainly would not have continued. God has given us warning after warning. In the Bible, God gets our attention. He corrects us through mishaps, through disasters. But every time one comes, we do just like they do in the Bible. We rebel more and more. In the Bible, it says this quote, "Why should I stricken you anymore? And you'll just rebel more and more." When God strickens a people, it is not out of his anger. He does so out of correction. But every time he does that to a people, they strengthen themselves and fight back anything that caused them to lose anything. Can you all see the simplicity of what is actually happening? And because the machine, the filtering machine, is broken in Congress, just for governmental things, they're never supposed to be in your homes. What in the world are they doing in your homes? That's another story. But anyway, they filter out certain things of leadership so that nothing looks like a monarch coming through the other side. It's broken. And now each side wants to establish itself as being the party that does it the right way. That's a monarchy. That is not democracy. If one person has a say-so, and it must be as that person wants, that is a monarchy. That is not democracy. That is dictatorship. That is everything this country was built against. Sadly, people don't understand that. People don't understand they need opposing views. Because if you don't have those opposing views, it is one side ruling all. How far have we slipped? You don't have to be a constitutional scholar to know these things. Do you see? We're following track with some of the ancient nations in times of old. They went through the same process. In fact, every country goes through the same process before they fall. Now, we can make a difference if we fall or not. The Christians can. If the Christians abandon their posts of prayer, of petition, of their heart being for and being thankful for this house, then no one is going to truly fight for it. They're only going to fight for themselves. See, all of our trust and faith should be in the living God. It should not be within men. And we've already been taught not to believe everything we read, no matter where it comes from. We know better than that. Our truth comes from the Spirit of truth, and there's no lie in the Spirit of truth. You're at a time now where you're either going to walk with men in the world and be X'd out by our Father, or walk in the Lord's way and be his child. See, you're not making a difference of Democrat and Republican. That's not what you're doing. You need to understand what's happening. You have an Antichrist, and a spirit of Antichrist out there that will use both the Democrat and the Republicans to accomplish its means. Don't you realize that? You can't pick a side among the world because the Antichrist is in both sides. How do we know that? God does not murder. God is not vile. And vessels of the living God have God's love in them. And their goal is redemption of their fellow man, not crucifixion or execution of their fellow man. Be careful of men. The Lord warned us in these days, do not put your trust in men. He already told us that the world will go back to fables and myths. He already told us that their stories will take your heart and supernaturally pull you into it. How many of you know right now that you've been supernaturally pulled into a cause and you don't know how you actually got there? It feels supernatural. Listen to me. The only thing supernatural you should ever have in your life is the pulling of the Holy Spirit from you being closer to Christ, not you being closer to some cause of men. Didn't the Lord say that in men is no truth unless he give it? But you're going to have to see that for yourselves. That will free a great many of you. But the Lord already told us during these times a spiritual betrayal would take place and many would fall away from the faith because they would choose something in the world. And if they continued on that path, then God would send them a strong delusion that they would believe a lie, that they all might be damned who loved not the truth but had pleasure in unrighteousness. What unrighteousness? To murder your brother. Any cause that makes you hate somebody else is not a cause of your Father in heaven. How simple is that? Doesn't matter what the cause is. Any cause that will make you hate your fellow man is not of your Father in heaven. Never once did he put in the hearts of anybody who followed him to hate King Nebuchadnezzar. Never once did he put in the hearts of anybody to hate specific people. Men do that. Men create mobs. Our Father redeems. Jesus has not come back. Mercy and grace is still here. Redemption is still his gospel. How fast do we forget? This is about redemption. This is about getting people out of the world who desire to exit, not to recruit more to go back into the causes of the world. The Lord didn't give the warnings to the world. He gave the warnings to us. He gave it to me. He gave it to you. Now you're in one of those times where you have to make a choice. See, if you choose the popular way, you're going to go along with the flow just so you can be accepted. If you choose the Lord's way, those same people are going to say, well, why why won't you join us in this against so-and-so? You don't want to face that, do you? You don't want to face being shunned by your fellow man to choose the ways of Christ. We've come down to the wire. Welcome to 2021. Now, how many people are going to talk redemption? They act like God is sleeping at his throne, like he can't do anything. Didn't he already say he would be watching everything here on earth? Didn't he say that his wrath would also be kindled at a specific time? God is not blind, nor is he deaf, but he sees all. And all Christians right now, all believers are being evaluated to see whether they are to be given over to a strong delusion or not. That strong delusion has been before you for a long time. Do you know what the Lord did in the Bible? Who he put judgment in? He put judgment in the Syrian, didn't he? He put judgment in Cyrus. I noticed he never put judgment in his own people, but he put it in elements who had already chosen the world. Thus the world and the earth will respond. There's a problem among the saints. They don't believe God will do anything, which is why they take matters into their own hands. If you believed that the Lord would exact punishment upon the guilty, you wouldn't do a thing. You pray for the people because you would understand how bad that punishment would be. If you don't believe, you'll say, let's take matters into our own hands like they have been doing it throughout history. That's what you'd say. Not seeing all sides of history, not knowing the actual players, believing all things of history that men write. I don't believe all things of history that men write. History is somewhat like a set of lies that men have agreed upon. More propaganda. People can skew history in many different ways, and through the internet, so many things have been disproven, it's not even funny. Not from anything new, though. From the words of the journals kept from several different people who spoke the opposite of what history books tell. God's children, however, already have a check in their spirits, a warning. Or it's one of those warnings, like if you proceed, you could potentially be parted. It's not your average spiritual check. Satan is offsetting this by doing everything he can do to appeal to either your race or anything else. Listen, I'm talking about both sides. He's trying to appeal to your flesh. He cannot appeal to you spiritually. Only your Father in heaven can do that, but he can appeal to everything in your flesh. So he will use everything in his arsenal to get you to follow the ways that the Lord called you out of. Remember that. Remember what the Lord called you out of. Remember the ways he told you to never be a part of again. Remember that. Don't do it because I'm suggesting it. Go read your Bibles in the King James Version in the New Testament and find out what Jesus said about the path you should walk, because I'm telling you now, everything you hear is going to appeal to your flesh. One way to get people stirred up is to tell them they've been betrayed. You know, we've seen this in Russia. We've seen the same thing in Germany. And what happened? Years after it was over, we found out much manipulation took place, didn't we? Only years after it was over. Look at all the people that followed Hitler. They actually believed in his cause. They believed just about everything they were presented, to the point where you had civilians killing civilians. Civilians going to house, rooting out people, and this, that, and the other. That's what you had. The country literally started to break up, and through false ideologies, it was put back together. Years after it was over, we found out they were doing devil worship and everything else. Hitler was lying to everybody and was hooked on drugs. But they believed everything he said. He made up a false history that they would follow. He told everybody that certain peoples betrayed that so-called republic, but we found out they didn't. That the ones who performed the violence betrayed everything. Hitler did. But Hitler spoke against others. He had people wiping Jews out left and right. Told people what Jews were involved in and everything else, didn't he? Until he started betraying other countries. He was floating away scot-free, but then something happened, didn't it? God brought to bear upon him a powerful nation called the United States of America and allied forces, one that he could not run from. He maintained his lie to the day of his death, and he died alone, so they say. I believe he escaped. I really do. I believe that he went right to South America. I really do, because the evidence is there. However, this guy had a whole place to it. But we had characters like that in history, on both sides of every single fence. And during the time when they were trying to convince everybody that the other side was evil, the other side was engaging in similar things. The only thing is that side lost. In all these cases, no side was good. That's the funny thing. We read about Hitler, but did you read about the other side? See, the change came when everything was knocked down and they had no choice but to rebuild under a different banner, because both sides were rotten. The side Hitler was on, and the other side was rotten to the core. The SS started taking over everything, but the other side was still rotten, doing rotten things, and all of them were fixated on the Jews, the real target. Who really paid the price there? The Jews did. That's who paid the price. It was like they built a trap. The propaganda began, but the traps were already built. When they started the roundups, they had already locked up everybody who could free them. Anybody who had a heart to free the Jews or obstruct them killing the Jews, they had already taken care of. Something similar to that could happen right here. Because when you're looking in one direction, I can guarantee you something is happening in a different direction you're not looking at. People are looking at their enemy across the street, and a massive problem is coming from above your heads. And while we tangle with one another in disputes, another country is going to take advantage of us. If we're tied up with our own civilians, we're going to be ineffective to assist anybody else, because morale is going to be broken amongst the troops if they ever see us at war. And to have the troops on standby to intercede for American dissidents should be a crime in this country of freedom. It's stood so long, and you're going to see things that happen you didn't expect. Those who believe that this thing is going to be handled according to some report, you're sadly mistaken. You're dealing with people who are relatively free. Do you know what happens if you try to put bondage upon a person who is free? They're going to fight for their lives. That means it's going to be you or them. If it escalates to that point, we've lost the republic already, because that's no longer a republic. It's not going to be like Civil War in times of old. No, you don't understand the weapons people can bring to bear, do you? I don't think that people realize the ammunition people can bring to bear. I really don't believe that you understand what will really happen. You know how many innocent people would perish out of ignorant fury that serves nothing but itself? And who will be at fault for that? I'll tell you who. Christians. That's what our Father says. The world's not going to be responsible. We are. Because we're the ones that agreed with evil, letting it through. Evil is evil. Evil always appears to be good and the right thing to do. Evil puts its hand around your shoulder, but evil will slowly talk you into murdering anybody. That's how you know it's evil. If it's causing you to take somebody else's life, it's evil. See, the gospel, the good news, is opposite. It tells you, see your enemy over there, love them through what they did to you. Speak to them about a glorious kingdom and tell them that the day has come that all their sins can be forgiven them through Christ Jesus. That's the gospel, the good news. That's not the news people bring to one another in this day and age. They have been peddling something else, and people are drifting away from the Word of God. And the Lord has already promised what He would do. Welcome to 2021, because supernaturally, things will begin to unfold that people are not ready for. It will humble everybody, but no one will escape it. Why? Because we refuse to have a heart transplant. Our hearts are hardened, our minds are hardened in a direction that men have made on both sides, and who's yielding to absolute truth, not interpreted truth, but absolute truth.